Okay, great. So welcome everyone to our webinar, Thriving in a Time of Uncertainty, Back to School 2020. We are really lucky today. We have Devin Gear here from Easter Seals Goodwill. She is an occupational therapist and she will be presenting today, addressing some of the social and emotional health concerns for our children as we prepare to go back to school in all of the new forms. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, and we are recording, so just so you're aware of that, we're going to have this recording available for our parents who couldn't join us live. So Devin, I will mute my mic and turn everything over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for having me. I'm so grateful to be able to join you this morning. Like Sophia said, my name's Devin, and I've been an occupational therapist working exclusively in pediatrics for about 7.5 years now. I've got a stepdaughter who's going back to school in 7th grade this year, which is crazy to think. And so I have sort of some personal experience with the topic at hand today, and recognizing that everyone's situation, depending on district, depending on state, depending on grade, is looking a little bit different. So, but what we are kind of all coming together on is how do we support our children and our families in making whatever option we choose and whatever comes as successful and geared towards thriving and resiliency as we possibly can. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. So thank you again for joining me. Because we do have a small group, I am perfectly okay if you unmute yourself, if you have questions, just sort of like if we were in person, I'd say raise your hand and go for it whenever you want. So that holds true for the webinar as well. So we go ahead and get started, and like Sophia did say, at the end there will be sort of an official Q&A time, but please feel free to pop on throughout if you have any questions or comments. So I like things to be interactive, otherwise I'm just talking to a little white dot on the top of my computer screen. So feel free to add. So this is a conversation about thriving during a time of uncertainty. We don't necessarily know what things will look like in school or in life from 1 week to the next at this point. So it's interesting to sort of be watching things continue to evolve all of these months later. So today we'll be discussing what could school look like. I know that you guys talked a little bit about this back in June, but again, that's been 7-8 weeks, and a lot has shifted during that time. So we'll talk about the pros and cons of each of the main approaches to school, how to advocate for our children during a pandemic, supporting emotional and sensory regulation. Because I am an OT, I always like to bring in the sensory aspect to what we discuss. So we'll be talking about how can we help our children build resiliency and meet those social and emotional health needs through a sensory lens as well. And then building resiliency and thriving. So without further ado, school options. First one, in person. So we have pros and cons to both, right? And these are obviously not a comprehensive list, but just some things moving forward that I felt and that the people I've spoken to, because I put out feelers when I found out that I had the opportunity to do this, put out feelers to a lot of different parents to get their perceptions as to what the pros and cons were. So here's what I've compiled. Pro for in-person, more comprehensive, immediate response instruction, right? You don't have to wait for your teacher to email you back. You're right there in person. Social interaction with adults and peers. And so what that basically means is that even if they can't be, closer than 6 feet apart, there's still a lot more interaction potential. Ease of access to auxiliary and specialized services. So it's a lot easier to go see the SLP, the OT, the school psych, all of those things when you're down the hall as opposed to, virtual or at home versus going into the school. For a lot of our kids that are in the special education programs, those class sizes are already fairly small, hopefully. And so you wouldn't necessarily be seeing a need for a mass reduction in class size necessarily, but again, every place is different. And then that predictability of routine, unless that changes as well, because who knows, we get 2 weeks in and who knows what it will look like. I know that some districts around the country are just barely And so I think that after a couple weeks of them being in session, we'll have more data to go off of as to what appropriate options are for our districts here. So those are some pros of in-person. And I don't know, I think a couple people have joined. So like I said in the beginning, feel free to unmute and add in anything. So if you have additional pros to in-person that you've thought of for your family or in general, please feel free to chime in. My voice is a little funky today, so I'll be grabbing a drink as we go through. Okay. So just as you know, there are always pros as well as cons. So here are some of the cons. And I'm gonna make my screen a little bit smaller. There we go. Some of the cons to in-person, if our kiddos get sick, there's an exacerbation of any medical diagnoses possible. And I know for a lot of our families, that is a huge con. So that's definitely something that we're all quite aware of by now. And so even though they are in class, it looks different than before more than likely. It's hard to be as hands-on. Social skills are more challenging. It's hard to say, okay, you know, let's work on taking turns and sharing when you can't share supplies and stuff. So some of those social skills, life skills concepts are a little bit harder to implement in 2020 COVID style. So it's also, and this is one of the things that we'll talk more about today, it can be hard to explain why things are the way they are. Why do we have to wear masks or some face covering, or why are other people wearing masks? Or it's scary to see people with masks and not be able to sort of do our best to gauge how they're feeling, reading body cues. So much of what we do is based on facial expression for a lot of us. And so being limited by that can make it really challenging. I do a lot of anecdotes, but I took my stepdaughter to the airport the other day, and she's 12. And I recognize I'm short, so I'm 5'3", and she's about as tall as I am. But we were both wearing our masks, and the TSA agent was like, "Well," talking to my stepdaughter, the 12-year-old, "Well, where's your ID?" And so because she had a mask covering the vast majority of her face, it was really hard for him to be like, "Oh, she's only 12." And so it's hard to read facial expressions. It's hard to sort of feel as connected and to sort of have a more complete picture of you know, who we're interacting with when you're missing 2/3 of a face. So that's something that can be really challenging for our kiddos and for all of us, including TSA agents. So, you know, masks and other barriers and all the sensory responses to those. We'll talk a little bit more today about some sensory-based strategies to sort of make mask wearing more tolerable, as well as some alternatives. So there's the dysregulation associated with the potential shift from in-person back to virtual. Again, we don't know, you know, who's to say that as we get closer to winter and flu season, and so then we're just compounding multiple other diseases and stuff onto this, who's to say what we'll get? So there is a potential for going back to virtual, and then the upheaval that can come from another shift in routine. So the second option that a lot of districts are offering is hybrid approach, right? So, you know, you're in class for part of it, or you're doing staggering where, you know, you're in class Monday, Wednesday, and not Thursday or Tuesday, Thursday, etc. There are a lot of different variations. So hybrid, the pros, there's the flexibility to be in person if safe, or virtual if feeling unsafe, numbers go up, needs change, etc. So it's kind of that built-in flexibility from day one, so that's pro. Because some of it is in person, there's the possibility for additional personalized assistance that might come with just being strictly virtual. And there's an increased role for parents and caregivers, which is its own pro and con, right? A lot of us have, you know, multiple other obligations, and so that can make it more of a challenge. But there are definite pros to being more hands-on with learning at times as well. So cons that go with the hybrid approach, variability in routine can be challenging for some children and some families. That's a lot of change. And then there's sometimes a challenge with the consistency of learning. I know that my stepdaughter doing virtual at the end of last year just was commenting consistently about how much harder it was to learn, because she'd gone from in person to virtual, and so she tasted the good life and didn't know what she was appreciating at the time. And then going to virtual was just kind of a shock to her system. So yeah, and then again, the con of increased role of parents that can be both a pro and a con. There we go. So virtual pros, biggest pro or one of the biggest, decreased risk of getting sick. You know, and like I said before, for our kids, that for any kid, but especially our kiddos, where there's, you know, more potential for complications. This is a huge pro. There's also the pro of a predictable one routine, right? So we're not hybrid back and forth. There's not the potential for having to go from in-person to virtual. It's just day one virtual. So that predictability can be a pro. Decreased adverse sensory experiences possible. Masks, daily sensory triggers at school. For a lot of our kids, or at least a lot of the kids I work with, where sensory processing is a significant challenge, school can be incredibly overwhelming. You know, demands to sit still for long periods of time, loud sounds, lots of people, crowds, everything. So school can be its own challenge from a sensory perspective. And so that is a potential pro that I've had a lot of families talk to me about, that goes along with the virtual aspect. Some cons for virtual: decreased social interaction, potentially more challenging to get personalized support. I think from March until now, our schools have done an incredible job of sort of preparing and revising the way they're going to be doing virtual. And so, you know, while it was incredibly challenging for a lot of schools to switch initially on, you know, on a dime, one day you're in, one day you're not, the next day you're not, I think that they've had a lot of time to sort of refine those approaches. So I do think that the personalized support will be much easier than it might have been in the beginning, but there is that potential. Increased demands on parents, again, potentially more challenging to access those auxiliary and specialized services, kind of like we talked about with the in-person pros. And also, like we talked about, some children find learning over Zoom and various other online platforms challenging without that personalized in-person immediate support. So on that note, anyone have any additional pros or cons or concerns that are applicable to your family or that you've heard other families talking about? And I can't see all of you, so I'll just take that as a no unless I hear anything while I take a drink. Here's your opportunity. Okay, we'll go ahead and continue on then. So one of the biggest questions that we're faced with is, how do we go about advocating for our children? And this is something that you all, as parents and guardians and caregivers, have become incredibly skilled at and adept at. And so hats off to you, because it's hard in, you know, for a typical school year, and this is anything but. So what does this look like for 2020? That looks like IEP revision requests, and recognizing that unfortunately there's going to be a lot of revision requests on top of sort of the typical review period, and so it might take a little while, which can be frustrating. But you know, looking into having those revisions done as needed based on your family's needs is huge. Compensatory plan for services if virtual school needs to recommence, if you're not initially choosing virtual. So having sort of a contingency plan in place for, okay, if we have to go back, what does that look like? What are the steps? What supports is my child going to have? How do we make sure those are lined up so we're not scrambling if and when that day comes like it did before? Similarly, a detailed outline of how to receive auxiliary specialized services. So, you know, regardless of if you're at home, virtual, hybrid, what is your OT, PT, SLP, school psych, etc.? What does that look like? How are we going to make sure that our kids get the resources that they need, which was one of the biggest challenges shifting so immediately from in-person to virtual back in March and April. It was really hard to sort of keep that trajectory going with the additional support. course, we also saw, I mean, I'm sitting in my home right now, so that tells you that I'm doing virtual as well. So we saw a lot of outside of school, like outpatient, early intervention, all of those services switch overnight to virtual as well. And just, I know that a lot of families have had a hard time with, okay, well, my child is making progress and getting their needs met, and now we're seeing a stagnation or even a backslide. And what am I supposed to do about that? Like, I am not a therapist, and so, and nor should you be, nor do you need to be. Like, your job is to be the parent and the caregiver. And so it's been a challenge to sort of, from a professional end, to help my families, you know, continue working on the goals that we've sort of identified, but also honor the fact that their priority is to be the caregiver. And it's my job to do the therapy work. And so how to sort of facilitate that without families becoming so overwhelmed, it's been hard. I'm sure a lot of you have probably felt that as well. So making sure that that is clearly outlined with your IEP team, with the school, just so that we're not left scrambling yet again if that does come up. And so one of the ways we do that is just remaining in close communication with education and treatment teams, regardless of which school format is chosen. Reaching out to various organizations. So United Angels, we've got the Utah Parent Center, a lot of great area resources that can help make sure that the advocating is being effective and heard, and that you're getting the responses from the school that you need. And lastly, mask exemption requests if needed. So I was looking over the state mandate from the governor yesterday that came out, I think it was July 17th, about sort of the exemptions. And it was slightly challenging to sort of tell if having the sort of doctor's note was obligatory, or if it was more, you know, make sure everyone on the IEP team is on the same page. And then there are some situations where you need a doctor's note kind of thing, but I'm sure that a lot of you, if mask exemptions is something that you're looking into, are already up to date, talking to your doctor, figuring out what your school specifically is looking for. So that's just one thing that I highly recommend, and we'll talk more about masks in a little bit. Any questions or thoughts on the advocating part? Okay. So how do we go about helping our children thrive? Because thriving and resiliency, those all come back into play with the social emotional health, right? So one of the ways that we support social emotional health is through routine. That consistency of a routine is huge for not only sort of our children that we're speaking about today, but our entire families and ourselves too, which is why we saw, for myself included, I can't speak for everyone, but at least for myself, like it took 3-4 weeks to sort of build up a new routine once I was stuck at home all the time. And so it's been sort of an interesting transition to create this new normal. And then what do we do when, again, those routines and schedules shift again? So benefits of routines include predictability, a sense of safety, kind of knowing what will happen, being able to rely on it. It creates grounding moments, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. It helps maintain schedule. And so sometimes it can be challenging to sort of make sure that we're getting in the eating, the playing, the sleeping, all at the times that we want them to be, when we're also, you know, running around trying to get all of these additional things dealt with, you know, on the phone to schools, dealing with virtual therapies, everything that goes into sort of current 2020 routine. It can be hard if we don't have that sort of routine built in with times and however detailed you need it to be. It also can help foster independence for our kids. And so whether that's, you know, you've got a little one where, you know, they know that, oh, we've eaten, and so looking at my schedule, I see the picture that says we're going to play next, and so I can point to it and remind mom and dad, hey, here's what we're doing, up to our teenagers where it can be, okay, you know, it's nighttime, it's bedtime, you know what you need to do, go take your shower, brush your teeth, et cetera, et cetera. So a whole gamut in terms of what that independence looks like and how we can foster it in our kids. But creating that sense of independence for our children, that is huge for building resiliency and that sense of competence and social and emotional well-being. It also sets clear expectations. You know, we're not going to have ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and watch TV, 24/7, unless that works for your family, in which case, have all the fun and enjoy some ice cream for me. But just sort of setting those clear expectations for what will be happening in your household, whatever that may look like. And then generating excitement for events, putting things on the schedule where you're like, tonight, we're going to have a family movie night, we're doing pizza, we're watching a movie together, or we're going on a walk, or whatever it is, to sort of give our kids and our family, ourselves, something to look forward to break up the monotony of quarantining. So, and again, with school, if you are doing an in-person or hybrid approach where there is some sort of school-based interaction, that goes into the routine. That can be something to be excited about as well for a lot of our kids. And so really making a point to celebrate, oh my gosh, it's Monday, you get to go to school, how exciting, you're going to see your teacher, just sort of setting them up for success, explaining what's going to happen. Yeah, we'll wear our masks to school and everyone else will be wearing, so those sorts of things, if masks are something you're doing, but just as an example, setting them up for success and going through the game plan for the day. It's like a dress rehearsal, right? So before they go out and perform, they've got to do the rehearsing, and that's a way to help build in that competency and that sense of resiliency. So components for a routine. We want a consistent morning and evening routine. That means, we get up around the same time, we brush our teeth, we have breakfast, we get dressed, all the things that go into a morning, and then, conversely in the evening. Whatever your morning and evening routines look like for you, make sure those are consistent. A consistent meal routine. And I say that, I don't necessarily mean at 8 a.m. on the dot, we always have breakfast. It's more like, here's what breakfast generally looks like for us. And there can always be sort of extenuating circumstances where, Friday night is movie night, and maybe we watch, while we watch our movie, we have snacks on the couch or something like that. So this isn't sort of a hard and fast, it must always look this way, but just sort of having those clear expectations that we talked about, that can be really beneficial in terms of meals as well, especially because at least a lot of the kids I work with, there's some picky eating or limited diets, working on food basically. And so having that consistent meal routine is extra important to them. Otherwise it's, well, if I can just take a bite and be on my merry way, then forget this sitting down and doing the work sort of thing. So then you're kind of creating more battles to face. So for all of my families, I'm big on the consistent meal routines and expectations. Similarly with sleep, a lot of the kids I work with also are working on sleep challenges. And so sleep routine is honestly one of the biggest things that you can focus on in terms of routine, just because sleep impacts daily life on every single level. Our memory storing happens during sleep. So many sort of growth and learning components occur during sleep. So we really want to make sure we're facilitating healthy sleep for our children and ourselves. And so keeping those times about the same, the wake time, the nap time, the waking up from nap time, the bedtime, all of those, as well as that routine that goes along with it. You guys sensing a trend yet? I really love routines with built-in flexibility. So making sure that there's a lot of active playtime, multiple times a day. Again, from a sensory standpoint, that provides a lot of heavy work opportunities, tactile, like sensory bin interactions, etc. So we'll talk more about that. Grounding routines. Things like, well, when I say grounding routines, what I mean is something that is a time for everyone to come together and just sort of, we are here, we're together as the family. This is something that we can count on, that's positive, that's, again, something to look forward to. And so that can be something like a family meal. You know, I've had families I've worked with where they're like at 5 o'clock when dad or mom gets home, we always have a dance party. Like we turn on a little disco light and we just go for it. Snuggle time at bedtime, anything that is consistent and connecting. Because I think that, you know, even if we're home, all of us all day, it can be hard to connect. Like I'm in my little office doing Zoom meetings all day. My stepdaughter, you know, was upstairs in her room doing her school, and my husband was doing his virtual. It's hard to connect. And then at the end of the day, it was really nice to be able to come together and go, how are we, you know, and just sort of reconnect. So it was good. And depending on the needs of our children, looking into a visual schedule for the day. And we want to go over it in the morning if there are any changes, or just to help, again, rehearse for the day what to expect. So another component of thriving, building in that social and emotional well-being, sensory and emotion regulation. So let's talk about that. For sensory regulation, since I am an OT, here's some things that we can do to just help build in helping our bodies and our neurological systems be regulated so we're better able to handle what life throws our way. And this goes for all of us. So having some sort of calm down corner, which I'll talk about more in a minute. A sensory diet, some of you may be familiar with that concept. It doesn't necessarily refer to what you're eating. It's not that sort of a diet per se. It's more about, you know, what are we feeding our bodies in terms of sensory input throughout the day? You know, maybe it's we stomp like the Hulk down to breakfast to help provide that heavy work and that vestibular input. And then maybe we always do like a sensory den after we wake up from nap to sort of help bridge that gap between sleepiness and being ready for more active play. So it's looking at the type of sensory input throughout the day. It can run a gamut from it's sort of built into that routine, here's what we're doing, very sort of regimented, built in, or towards the other end of that spectrum is you use it as you need it, right? So maybe your kiddo does fine in general until we hear like a fire engine go by, and then it's like it's too loud, and so we're having to do more of a reactive approach to helping deal with that sensory overload. So you know your family best. Feel free to talk to any OTs that you're working with, if anything, or you know, look online at some reputable OT websites, or reach out to me. I'll have my contact info at the end for additional sensory diet information and support. Heavy work. For those of you who are not familiar with that term, it is a sort of a concept for proprioception, which is all the information, the input that we get from our muscles, ligaments, tendons, joints, and our body to say, here's where we're at, and here's how much force we're using in the world. So that's something where like you expect a door to be really heavy, so you like push into it really hard, and then you stumble through because it wasn't heavy. So generating the appropriate amount of force to use for a situation, that's a component of proprioception, and how that translates into what we do in a day-to-day world is heavy work. So think about when we see like a person in the military doing their run, they've got like that 100-pound pack on their back, and we get tired just watching them, at least I do. That is an example of heavy work. It's a lot harder to run with 100 pounds on your back than it is to just run. And so thinking about how can we create additional exertion opportunities for our children, that can be an incredibly beneficial thing to be incorporating throughout the day, because while some sensory input is alerting, helps like build you up, gets you energized, and some is calming, helps you relax, heavy work is this golden ticket item where it organizes the sensory system. And what that means is if your Tigger bouncing off the walls helps bring you down, if your Eeyore kind of lethargic down on the floor, helps build you up. So heavy work is our favorite thing in the world when it comes to sensory input. And those are things like pushing, pulling, carrying, dragging. It's when our toddlers wanted to push the large boxes or the chairs around the living room all day long. That's heavy work. Any questions so far? Okay. So looking at the calm down corner real fast, you know, I like to think about it in terms of various senses. So here on the slide, you'll see some examples of things to incorporate for each sense. For vision, things like a lava lamp, or they have a lot of apps that just sort of have these undulating nebulous things going on that, you know, we can watch. Looking at favorite pictures, having a book of family members or favorite objects or memories, things that sort of help induce calm and okay, I can get out of my body and my brain enough to focus on this other positive thing. Peaceful scenes, so pictures of nature can be another sort of example of that. And then projectors, like those night lights that are stuffed animals that project onto the ceiling, things like that, where it gives us something external to focus on and gets us out of ourselves. Because at that point, if we're needing to calm down ourselves, our own body is in a flight, fight mode, or fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so we need to be able to get out of that to be able to calm down. Touch, things like a soft blanket, a favorite stuffed animal. Sometimes vibration can be really beneficial. It depends on the person and the type of vibration. But for a while we had those little neck pillows that you kind of wrap around and it vibrated. So that sort of a thing can be calming for some people. And then various fidgets. And sort of the caveat and my little asterisk when it comes to calm down corners, you know your child best. If we're going to be going into a calm down corner, the goal is to get there before we're having a full-blown meltdown. But if we have reached that point, it might be prudent to remove some of these objects that may become projectiles if there's just no, like if we're past that point of no return, keeping in mind how your child responds in a meltdown moment and if some things would benefit from being removed momentarily until they have calmed down. So there's my caveat. For sound, nature sounds, just think about like what have we used for our kids going to bed? Lullabies, guided meditations for our slightly older children. So can you take a deep breath in, breathe out, all of that stuff. Pretend you're walking along a beach, everything. And then there are a lot of great read aloud book options these days. A lot of celebrities, in fact, have done a ton of YouTube or various other platforms reading aloud, which has been great. And then taste and smell, combo those two together. Calming scent on that favorite soft blanket or stuffed animal. Again, this one is, do at your own discretion, but a food or a drink that requires sucking. Sucking is inherently calming. Think back to day one, babies, what do? They suck, and that calms them down. So things that require sucking can be really beneficial. Putting that scent on an object specifically. So calming scent up top just refers to, you spray some essential oils or room scents or whatever, and then the scent on the object can be some additional support. Sometimes lotion and a massage can be helpful, more for the smell aspect as well as the touch. And then for the last section, vestibular and proprioception, weighted objects. Some of you may be familiar with the benefits of weighted blankets, so that sort of a thing. A weighted stuffed animal, weighted lap pad, weighted whatever. Providing that deep pressure, which is what weighted objects are, is inherently calming for the vast majority of people. And so similarly, we've got like big squeezes and hugs. Rocking is a vestibular sensory input that is typically calming. Think rocking chairs, hammocks, porch swings, those sorts of things, typically calming. And I say typically because I've also worked with a lot of kids where they kind of needed the reverse of that. Excuse me. Hold on. I've worked with children where they needed to sit on one of those sit and spins that maybe some of us used to have and just spin so quickly for a good 5 or 10 minutes to calm down. So I always encourage families to try out these activities, figure out what works best for your child when they're already calm. Because it's really hard to learn something and become used to a new activity or tool when we're already in that heightened sense of moving towards fight, flight, freeze. So try all these out, help your child learn what to do with them when they're already in a calm state of mind. And then, cushions or blankets to go under to be sort of squished more or to sort of burrow under, that can be really soothing and calming for children. Okay, sensory regulation when it comes to masks and face coverings. Biggest thing, or one of the biggest things, we want to build tolerance for masks and other face coverings. So you guys, one of your jobs is to decide on the best face covering for your child, if that is something that's applicable for your child. Thinking about the mask material, a face shield, and face shields are coming along where they're on the headband, they're on a hat, they're on glasses. So there are a lot of options for that. I've seen some that have like a loose cowl neck sort of scarf that goes with it, so it's actually blocking more. So then it becomes more of like a giant mask with a face shield combo. Whether we have the bandana around the ears versus around the head, all of those things come into play. And I think that oftentimes the material can play a really big role in terms of the breathability and how our children are feeling in there. We want to begin with short periods of time wearing a mask with a timer in familiar environments. You're at home, we're watching TV, or doing something that's distracting, we're playing with a fidget or a toy, we're just doing something where their minds are more likely to be off of wearing a mask. And you know your child best, so start with as slow as or little amount of time as you possibly need. So if you think your child can only handle 2 minutes, start there and build up from there, because it's all about meeting them where they're at and building upon it. And then we want to be providing that calming sensory input before, during, and after as needed. So looking back at the calm down corner, various things like that. Heavy work will be key. Like, let's get all of our wiggles out, and then we're going to sit down and watch a show while we have this mask on, and then we're going to do more heavy work, etc. Other things to think about: mask social stories. And social stories are a huge benefit, not just for things like masks, but just to sort of help make sense of COVID in general, and quarantine and precautions and all those things. Explaining to children using social stories. And I think there should be a link in the notes section to this slide, hopefully, with a link to sort of a mask social story specifically. But these can be incredibly beneficial to just sort of look at multiple times, help build that understanding, and then relate it to sort of everyday life as you're going. And so sometimes that can be like, you read your social story and then you go, look, he's wearing a mask just like we read about, and sort of generalizing it that way can be really beneficial. Your job is to model a mask as well. And by that, I mean you or a stuffed animal or a sibling or anything. I know we all have different situations and circumstances. So use a modeling technique that works for you. Show pictures of family, superheroes, people that they, look up to, a hero to them, characters wearing masks. And then pretending to be someone who wears a mask. So, okay, we're going to pretend to be Batman today, or a doctor, et cetera, et cetera. So using those motivating techniques to help make it more relatable and almost like a costume. And I've seen a lot of really cute masks and face shields that have been sort of renoed into a costume type of a thing, which is really fun. Okay, troubleshooting. Glasses. So if your child wears glasses, put a piece of tissue or connects across the bridge of the nose under the mask. That can help sort of absorb some of that moisture so you don't get fogged up glasses. If we have kiddos who are really sensitive to smell, using mints or brushing teeth prior to wearing that mask, just so that you're not inhaling the breakfast scent that you had earlier that day. We talked briefly earlier about the face shield attached to a hat, the glasses. I've been seeing more and more masks with that clear plastic over the mouth to see lips, which thank goodness, because that is a huge benefit to a lot of our children, especially, hearing impairment, et cetera, and also just to sort of be able to feel more connected to people, to be able to read facial expressions a little bit better. If drooling is a concern, face shields, frequent replacement of mask, and mask absorbent material options, neither of those are ideal. And I know that for a lot of our kids, drooling is a sort of considerable concern. And so that's something where that medical exemption might be beneficial, but really just doing whatever you can. And if you're in a situation where a mask is mandatory, replacing it, flipping and switching it out as often as needed, because we don't want to build up sort of a lovely little home for bacteria and moisture to build. That's not ideal at all. So And then, as I mentioned at the bottom, that medical waiver if necessary. Okay, emotion regulation, things like validating feelings. I know it's so hard when we want to go see our friends. You must be feeling sad, or like, are you feeling sad? So you can kind of, if they're at an age where identifying feelings in themselves is still a challenge, you can sort of label it and validate it. I think you're mad because your arms are crossed and your eyebrows are together and you're stomping your feet. I'd be mad too if I couldn't see my friends. I hear you. So validating, creating a coping plan, sort of knowing what to look for when we see those emotions start to escalate. And if our kids are older, or the sort of self-reflection capabilities are there, helping them to recognize what it feels like when their emotions are starting to escalate. Ooh, it looks like your body is feeling tense because your shoulders are, hunched up, etc. So helping them recognize it in themselves is going to be huge as our kiddos move towards more of that self-regulation piece. Identifying some coping strategies. Those can be sensory-based or emotion-based. And then identifying how to get those needs met. So, okay, when you're feeling mad, we come to mom, we come to dad, just sort of creating a game plan, right? And then we build towards more of that self-regulation. We've got some physical strategies, things like deep breathing, meditation, yoga, and then things like movement, exercise, heavy work, deep pressure. Some of those we've talked about before. And lastly, it's kind of like a portable calm down corner, but it's a happy box. And so we fill it with objects that bring joy and distraction. So pictures of loved ones, little snacks, fidgets, toys, special things that we don't always get to play with. And so when we're really struggling, that can be a welcome distraction. Okay, and so the last thing, I am being cognizant of time. I know that I tend to talk a lot, so we'll keep trucking through, but please feel free to add in or interrupt as needed. We want to build resiliency and create a message of hope for children. So here's what that looks like. We want to create as many opportunities for our children to feel in control as possible. And obviously control looks different for different ages, different developmental levels, all of that. But as much as we can, we want them to feel in control of something in this very out of control world. They're very in tune and adept, regardless of their age, regardless of developmental level. They get it. They get it far more than we give them credit for often. And so they pick up on tension and just frustration and ambiguity that a lot of us are feeling. And so giving them a sense of control is key. So that might look like, let's see, the little thumbnail blocks my words that I wrote down. So you choose. Should we read, when you give a mouse a cookie, or Good Night Moon, and you're holding up both? Or, hey, for our family night tonight, do you want to do pizza or tacos? So giving as much control as we can based on age, developmental level, that's huge. We also want to facilitate opportunities for our children to do things independently. And so that kind of goes back to what we talked about with the routine and creating that independence. Whether it's for our little guys being like, there's a picture of like my favorite ball, that means time to play. Come on, mom and dad, like let's do this. Up to, okay, I know I can trust you to go do your school or go take a bath or whatever it is. Just building that independence. Practicing gratitude with your children. Oh, I'm so grateful that we got to see that beautiful sunset. Let's look at all the colors. And then you're creating a learning opportunity too. But anyways, practicing gratitude, finding those small things where even if all this other stuff is going on, man, we can really focus in on how lucky are we to have this experience, or to have been able to have dinner all together tonight, or whatever, Zoom with grandma, etc. Demonstrating hopeful optimism. Oh, I'm really looking forward to when we'll be able to X, Y, and Z. So creating that sort of forward-looking thing, and of course, unfortunately, you want to make sure that it is something that you will be able to do eventually. That might be, I'm so excited for us to go on that walk tonight. So creating that excitement, that is something that can happen regardless of what sort of quarantine type things may be taking place. So I wouldn't do something like, I'm so excited for when we go on vacation to Hawaii in January. because we don't know if it's going to happen. So picking those things carefully as to what you demonstrate hopeful optimism for, and just keeping in mind that social distancing does not equal social isolation. I 100% get that it is a ton harder, absolutely. But there are a lot of virtual options that are in place now, which is huge. And so here's my gratitude. I'm so grateful for all the virtual options. So for me, it gives me a chance to stay connected to my stepdaughter who's just gone on the plane to go to school in Texas with her mom. So it's one of those things where virtual isn't the same as in person, but man, we can really make it work and we can find the benefit in it. And then staying busy. So not excessively busy, but just filling the day with meaningful things. And then downtime too, because busy doesn't necessarily mean boom, 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 all these activities. It can mean, you know what, I need to go take a shower or take a nap or just breathe or, sneak secret candy up in my closet that you can't find, sort of thing, whatever it is. And so this is your time to watch a show or, to have some quiet time, whatever. So busy doesn't equal frantic. It just means the day is filled in a way that feels good to you. So the last thing that I want to touch on for building resiliency and that social emotional well-being, we want to provide reassurance to our children that, even with everything going on, they are heard for all of their feelings. We talked briefly about that, but it's labeling, it's validating, it's supporting. I can tell that you're feeling mad because your shoulders are hunched, blah, blah, blah. It's hard when we can't see our friends. Do you want a hug? Should we Zoom our friends? So offering that support. We want our children to know that they are taken care of. Regardless of what happens, they will be taken care of. We can't guarantee by who sometimes. Sometimes it may be where grandma needs to come in and help out or, something goes on. But we can guarantee them that they will be taken care of and that they are safe. And most importantly, that they are loved. And so that's something that I know you guys all do an incredible job with, just by nature of the organization you're associated with right now. And the fact that you're attending this webinar relatively early on a Wednesday morning and listening to this random person blab at you for 45 minutes straight, almost 50, sorry. So just making sure that they know they are loved and that all will be well. We don't necessarily know when or how or what that will look like, but all will be well. And so that can be an incredibly uplifting and reassuring and just social emotional building sort of an action. And that can become kind of a mantra for you guys at night. You put them to bed and you go, we're okay, we're safe, we're loved, whatever it is, whatever's going to sort of resonate with your family, just making that something that is on repeat. With my stepdaughter, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the author Glennon Doyle, but my goodness, my poor stepdaughter by now has heard me say we can do hard things thousands of times, but it's one of our mantras and we can. So that's just something that we use in our house a lot. So we made it to the end. We talked about what school could look like, how to advocate, sort of that sensory and emotion regulation piece, because those are huge when it comes to social and emotional well-being. And then also, how do we build that resiliency and encourage thriving in a time of uncertainty? So we've covered all the topics that we wanted to. And now with our remaining time, and I'll be available for a little while after as well, questions, comments, thoughts. Don't be shy.
And folks, we are encouraging you, if you feel comfortable, you can unmute your microphone and turn on your camera if you want to comment or ask your questions using the mic in the video. Or if you prefer to use the chat feature, please feel free to type your questions in the chat and I'm happy to read them for you.
I have a question. I was just about the hard work. Is there like a type of, because I have a teenage son and he's got low muscle tone. And so what kind of activities do you think would be good for him? And also I've got, typical kids that are younger, like, well, how do you encourage them to do hard work? What's the motivating thing? Is it kind of like working out as a family, or I don't know, just wondered if you could give me some ideas.
Great question. So heavy work really it can take any form that we wanted to. So my question back to you would be, what does your son enjoy? You know, and so we can honestly add, we can make almost any activity more challenging to do. And so it's things like, you know, if he's motivated by, well, most kids, most teenagers are not motivated by gardening. So let me just ask you, what are some of his favorite activities? And I'll give you some examples for how to beef that up a little bit in terms of the intensity of it.
See, that's the hard thing for me, is because with his low muscle tone, his favorite activities are things that are very, you know, like he can do sitting down, like he loves to read and he likes to write stories and he likes to play on the computer. And so when I try to think of how to work his muscles, I'm kind of drawing a blank.
Sure. Yeah, and so sometimes that can look like, you know, simply moving the books from one room to the other. Hey, you know what, we're gonna go read up in your room today. Why don't you bring the books you've got stacked down here up to your room? That can be, you know, after 15 minutes of video games, walk around the house one time, or go up and down the stairs, or, you know, help me carry in the groceries. So it doesn't necessarily have to be related to favorite activities if they are just sort of innately more sedentary, but it can be short little bursts of around the house, sort of helping out, or activities to build in those moments, because they do add up. And so does that kind of give you some beginning ideas for him specifically?
It does. I sure appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just to sort of go off of that with your other children, yeah, I mean, they've got a lot of great YouTube channels for sort of kids exercise right now, some more engaging than others. But a lot of times it can just be like, hey, we're gonna create an obstacle course. Like let's go outside, let's, you know, put the chairs out, let's crawl under, over. I don't know how old your other kids are, but it might also be something like, let's go do sidewalk chalk, because it takes a lot of exertion to use the chalk. You know, it might be, hey, we're gonna color on a big piece of paper on the wall today, because it takes more exertion to color, you know, upright on a vertical surface than it does to just sort of draw on a table. It can be, we're going on a family walk, and the walk happens to have some hills involved, and hey, would you mind being in charge of carrying our snacks for us? You wear the backpack, and now we can trade off who's wearing it. So it can take the form of various activities, and we're just tweaking it a little bit to make it a little bit more challenging physically.
That sounds awesome. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And just to sort of clarify for everyone, if you're looking up these sorts of activities online, because there are gazillions of ideas, it's heavy work instead of hard work. Also, and one other thing that might be applicable to your older son too, Greta, is it doesn't have to be heavy work just for the whole body. It can be heavy work for the mouth. So whether it's, you know, slurping up applesauce through one of those swirly straws, or a milkshake, or a smoothie, or just anything that requires really hard sucking or really hard chewing. So for anyone who's had a Cliff Bar, my jaw hurts after having a Cliff Bar. I don't know if anyone else's does, or chewing gum for a long time, or stale licorice. It can be those more oral sensory based heavy work activities as well as like fine motor. So, you know, we take a break from the video game and we work on our thinking putty, is that what they call it these days? But like Theraputty or Silly Putty. Just working on more of that fine motor aspect of heavy work as well. So there are a lot of different ways to incorporate heavy work if your child's like, I don't feel like walking up a hill together today. So there are options.
Thanks. That's perfect. I think he could use some work on his chewing. So that's great recommendation. Appreciate it.
Good thing.
Okay, I have a question.
Sure.
I joined late, so maybe you did talk about this at the first, but my son is, and by the way, everything has been super helpful. Thank you for all your great ideas and thinking through all these things. It's been great. Okay, so my son's going into high school. With this schedule, he'll be having, you know, an A day and a B day. And so once a week he'll go to class, right? Because it's 2 days. So he'll have A day and he'll have a B day, but a lot of the classes won't be the same. And so I'm trying to think of different things that maybe creative ideas of how we can include some modifications in his IEP of ways I don't know. I guess I don't know how this is going to look in the, how to even do it, but I'm meeting with his teacher to go over his IEP and see if we need to do modifications. So I was just wondering if you have seen any creative ideas that people have done to specifically deal with this interesting time.
Yeah, and that's always tough. I guess my initial thought is sort of whatever looks appropriate to him in terms of a schedule and routine to go off of and talk about each day. And so there's some kids that might be like a little picture of something that symbolizes each of the classes, and then that morning at breakfast you're like, okay, today's A day, which means you're going to homeroom and math, and and kind of going through it that way. For some kids, it can be beneficial to have it on a sheet of paper that they take with them and they can check off as they go. So I don't have any specific creative things that I've seen people throwing around the internet for these interesting times specifically. But my biggest suggestion is to just make sure that that rehearsal is in place. And so he knows what to expect on what day, maybe some additional support with organization, making sure that we're all prepared for that day. But I haven't seen any wildly creative ideas.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. What about for the days that he will be at home with the having support from the school? Have you seen any creative ideas on that, of what they could be doing at home?
That I have not either, and I think that's where they're hopefully not feeling as sort of, oh no, what do we do, as perhaps they did in the beginning. And I do think it'll be interesting as we move in about the middle of August, because there are some districts around the country that are starting now. So I think it'll give us more insight as to options. I think some of the things that I would bring up with your IEP team is just sort of identifying what specific supports are going to be available to my child. What are those going to look like? Who are my contact people? What is sort of the turnaround time that we can expect? Because I think that it can be really frustrating for parents and kids if you're like, I haven't heard from my teacher in a day, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this math homework, and now I'm really frustrated. And I'm speaking from personal experience from my stepdaughter earlier last year. Just being
right.
Like, I don't know, like, what am I supposed to do? And I'm like, I haven't done 6th grade math in years, and I have a Zoom call, so it's just making those very clear expectations from day one, and just sort of building upon that. And honestly, asking them, because that's their job, to have some strategies in place, and then you can kind of come back with, okay, well, I don't know if this will work, but I think this will work, this other thing, and just sort of creating that open dialogue, and making it clear, like, this is new for all of us. It would be very beneficial to me to know that we could reassess and revise as we go. So maybe we check in every 2 weeks and go, is this working? And if not, what do we need to shift?
Oh yeah, I like that. That's great.
So that
okay.
The periodic check-ins are huge for all of us, especially when so much hangs in the balance for a successful year right now.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Devin, we have a question from the chat here. When tubes were put in my daughter's ears, her sensory balance was totally thrown off. Suddenly, she was bothered by hot water during showers, spicy foods she liked before bothered her, and noise, all of which she didn't struggle with before. She's gotten over those, but noise sometimes bothers her, like clapping or cheering. It's on and off. Why do tubes do that, and how do you get back on track?
The mysteries of tube placement. One of the reasons, and there are a lot of theories, but one of the reasons is because tube placement does play a significant role in both hearing and potentially vestibular input, that it's kind of like everything's interrelated, right? And so while it may be only impacting 2 senses outwardly, or sort of initially, it can have sort of a cascade effect on other senses and just sort of tolerance levels. There's no sort of clear cut, oh, well, because the tube was placed, clearly her tolerance for spiciness has gone down. Like, it doesn't really make sense in that regard. but I think one of the biggest sort of explanations is just that everything is thrown out of whack. It's not just those two senses, since there's sort of a cascade effect. So here's an example of how I like to think about sensory processing that may help, or it just may muddy the waters more, but we'll see what we get. It's the idea of we all have cups, right? So each sense has a different cup, and some of our cups are really little, and it doesn't take much to overflow them, and some of our cups are a lot bigger, and so it takes more to sort of reach that point of my cup is full enough for me to be paying attention and engage, and not too full where I'm like, I can't even handle this. So we took her auditory cup and her vestibular cup, and we overflowed them when we added the tubes in, because suddenly everything was louder and balance might have been a little bit off, like all of these things. And so where does it overflow? Into other cups. Does that kind of help explain that and that first aspect? I hope so. And then how do we get back on track was the second one. Honestly, it's a matter of meeting each challenge as it comes. So if clapping is too much for her, then we do earplugs or headphones, or sometimes even a hood is enough to sort of muffle it a tiny bit, or we make sure we're sitting at the back of the auditorium, or hey, there aren't a lot of auditoriums full of people right now, so that's another coping strategy. So I always encourage parents to just sort of meet the new challenges as they come, and that can also be something where a sensory diet can just sort of help make sure that all of those cups are at their optimal fullness, and it creates a little bit more wiggle room, and we're not sort of riding that line of, okay, we're kind of okay, and then overwhelmed, overload sort of a thing. So it helps us be more even keel and handle more things to incorporate those sensory activities throughout the day as well. So it's like that proactive of regulation, and then that reactive of, oh, we weren't expecting a large crowd of clapping people. Okay, what do we do about that now? And so having that reactive calming strategy components as well. I hope that makes sense for whoever asked, and if not, please feel free to type in follow-up questions or unmute or whatever you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, any other questions?
Okay. All right. Well, Devin, we are after 10 o'clock here, so I appreciate you staying a little bit late for us, and I appreciate all of the parents who joined us today. I will be sending out the link to the recording. I put the slides in the chat box, so you can access the file there if you wanted to review the slides. And Devin, I just want to thank you again on behalf of all of our families. Thank you so much for putting this together and taking the time to help us talk about social emotional health and sensory regulation.
You are so welcome. And then I'll throw up this last slide so that you guys do have my contact information. You're welcome to reach out, email, text, whatever works best for you if you do have any additional questions on any of these things. And I wish you all a very happy and smooth sailing back to school time.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.